Every year, Christians all over the world commemorate the crucifixion of Jesus on the Friday before Easter, or what we refer to in English as Good Friday. But was Jesus really crucified on a Friday? And why do we call it Good Friday anyway? Let's get into it. Howdy, folks. You can help me keep making this podcast and get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. First, let's talk about the day on which Christians around the world commemorate the crucifixion of Jesus, or Good Friday. It's the Friday before Easter Sunday, which is the first Sunday after the first full moon on or after the spring equinox. This is because the Jewish people used a lunar calendar, that is, a calendar based on the cycles of our sister planet, the moon. We can go into the details of how Easter Sunday works in a future episode, but Good Friday is the Friday before Easter. But why do we call it Good Friday? I mean, if that was the day that Jesus was crucified, well, being crucified isn't really a good thing. Certainly not if you're the one being crucified. It wasn't very good for you at all. And that leads to the first folk etymology, or supposed word origin, for the term Good Friday. According to this view, being crucified wasn't good for Jesus, but it was good for us. It's how he saved us from all our sins. And so that's why we call it Good Friday. However, folk etymologies are really just popular guesses about where a word came from, and they're often not accurate. That leads us to a second folk etymology, which holds that Good Friday was originally known as God's Friday, and that if you say God the right way, God's Friday, it becomes Good Friday. This folk etymology is actually based on an element of truth, because sometimes we do use expressions in English that turn the word God into good. This is the case, for example, with the word goodbye. It's a contraction of God be with ye. I myself ran into this explanation a number of years ago, and there really are expressions in English where God has become good. Unfortunately, Good Friday isn't one of them. It turns out that the phrase Good Friday is based on a meaning that the word good used to have. In Middle English, good had the sense of holy or sacred, and that's where we get Good Friday. Holy or Sacred Friday, that is the Friday of Holy Week, thus became Good Friday. So that's one mystery solved, but how do we know that Christ was crucified on a Friday at all? In Matthew 12, Jesus says, "Just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights." This has widely and correctly been understood as a reference to the period he spent in the tomb between the crucifixion and the resurrection. However, it raises a question about the timing of these events. Many people ask, well, if Jesus was crucified on Good Friday, how could he rise on Easter Sunday? That's not 3 days and 3 nights later, at least not by our reckoning. If Christ died on Friday afternoon and rose from the dead on early Sunday morning, then that's not 3 full days. It's only 1 day plus parts of 2 others. To solve this dilemma, some propose that Jesus was actually crucified earlier, on a Wednesday. That way, he could lie in the tomb all of Thursday, all of Friday, and all of Saturday, only to be raised early on Sunday. Every year, I get messages from people telling me that I, and the vast majority of Bible scholars, both Catholic and Protestant alike, don't know what we're talking about when we place the crucifixion on Friday. And Matthew 12:40 is presented as conclusive proof of this, as something that we as chronologers apparently have never thought about before. But we have. Let's start by noting that although the Church commemorates Jesus' death on Good Friday, the traditional chronology of Holy Week is not a dogma of the faith, and scholars can explore other options. For example, in his Jesus of Nazareth series, Pope Benedict XVI discussed the views of the French scholar Annie Jobert, who proposed that the Last Supper actually took place on Holy Tuesday rather than Holy Thursday. That view is commonly shared by advocates of a Wednesday crucifixion, though Jobert still places the crucifixion itself on Good Friday. After exploring the arguments proposed by Jobert, Benedict observes that Annie Jobert's theory, so fascinating on first sight, is rejected by the majority of exegetes. He then offers his own conclusion, stating, "So while I would not reject this theory outright, it cannot simply be accepted at face value in view of the various problems that remain unresolved." For the Pope to publish a book in which he says that the theory is fascinating at first sight and that he doesn't reject the theory outright, even though he ultimately isn't persuaded by it, is a clear indicator that alternative chronologies are possible. You're not denying a teaching of the faith if you have another view of the chronology of the crucifixion. This is a matter to be settled by following the evidence and seeing where it leads. So, what evidence is there? Let's begin with Matthew 12:40, the verse that many take as proof that Jesus was crucified on a Wednesday. The first thing that we need to note is that this verse is not conclusive. That is, it doesn't actually prove the proposal under discussion. If you take the phrase 3 days and 3 nights in isolation, you realize that, taken in the most literal sense, it would be a period of 72 hours. Anything more or less than that, and it's not exactly 3 days and 3 nights. For example, if it were only 70 hours instead of 72, that would be less than 3 full days. And if it was 74 hours instead of 72, that would be more than 3 full days. But one of the things that the Gospels agree on is that Jesus died late in the day. Mark records that when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And John records that, so because of the Jewish day of preparation, as the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. They thus needed to bury Jesus quickly because it was late in the day and night was about to begin. They had to do this because the book of Deuteronomy required that if a man has committed a crime punishable by death and he is put to death and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. This was interpreted to mean that you didn't let the sun go down on an executed man, so they needed to bury Jesus before nightfall, which is why they used Joseph's nearby tomb. So the model of Jesus being in the tomb Thursday, Friday, and Saturday is mistaken. Jesus would have been crucified late in the day on Wednesday, meaning that he would have been in the tomb for more than 72 hours if he rose early on Sunday. The situation gets even worse when you try to make Jesus stay dead in the tomb for exactly 72 hours. In that case, Jesus rose from the dead before Saturday night arrived, and he either just hung out in the tomb all Saturday night and into Sunday morning, or he left the tomb as soon as the 72 hours were up and it was empty the whole of Saturday night and into Sunday morning. This is very hard to fit with the idea of the early Christians identifying the first day of the week, or Sunday, as the day Jesus rose from the dead and celebrating it as the Lord's Day, as we read in Revelation 1:10. We must therefore recognize that this expression, 3 days and 3 nights, is not to be taken as fully literal, as a reference to exactly 72 hours. It involves a figurative expression. To understand that expression, we can't impose our own culture's ideas. We need to look at how ancient Jewish authors used language, and here scholars are clear. As conservative Protestant Bible scholar R.T. France notes, 3 days and 3 nights was a Jewish idiom to a period covering only 2 nights. Similarly, D.A. Carson, another conservative Protestant Bible scholar, explains, in rabbinical thought, a day and a night make an onah, and a part of an onah is as the whole. Thus, according to Jewish tradition, 3 days and 3 nights need mean no more than 3 days, or the combination of any part of 3 separate days. 3 days and 3 nights is just an especially demonstrative way of saying 3 days. It doesn't literally mean 72 hours. And because of the ancients' tendency to count parts for wholes, that is, to round numbers up, the 3 days of Jesus' death were the final part of Friday, all of Saturday, and the first part of Sunday. Of course, the phrase 3 days and 3 nights with no further context could mean 72 hours, but we have context for Matthew's use of this phrase. Ultimately, one can't use a single verse that can be understood in more than one way to overturn all the other evidence we have from the New Testament and from later in the Gospel of Matthew itself. You'll note that in Matthew, the Jewish authorities asked Pilate to order the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. That is the standard way that Jesus referred to the time he would rise. There are at least 8 cases in the Gospels indicating that he rose on the 3rd day. Mark also records 3 instances of him saying that he will rise after 3 days, and John has him saying that it will happen in 3 days. However, the standard way of referring to the timing of the event was on the 3rd day, which is a usage that's also found outside of the Gospels. To understand which day was the 3rd, one must understand a couple of things about how biblical authors counted. The first unit of time after something happens begins immediately after the event. We still use that convention today. It's why a president's first year in office is the one that begins immediately upon his inauguration. His first year isn't complete until he reaches his 12-month anniversary. Where the ancients differed from us is that they would often count parts for wholes. For example, they would often consider an emperor's first year to be the time from when he took office to the beginning of the next calendar year. His second year would then begin with New Year's Day, meaning that his first year wasn't 12 months long. But though it was only part of a 12-month period, it still counted as a year. The same thing happens to other units of time, such as months, weeks, days, and hours, and this has implications for the crucifixion. Jesus died at around 3 p.m. on the day of preparation, which means the first day of his death was the remainder of the day of preparation between 3 p.m. and sunset. The second day then began at sunset and lasted through the entire Sabbath. That is, it included Friday night and Saturday daytime. The third day then began at sundown on the Sabbath and lasted until sunset on the first day of the week. That is, it was Saturday night and part of Sunday daytime. This is why on the road to Emmaus, the disciples can tell Jesus that it is now the 3rd day, since these things, meaning the crucifixion, have happened. We thus have abundant evidence pointing to the Friday, Saturday, Sunday chronology with Jesus being raised on the 3rd day, or Sunday. But we can go further than this by looking at the data that each of the 4 Gospels provides to us. To do that, though, we need to understand 3 terms. The first term we need to understand is the first day of the week. Today, we call this day Sunday, but the early Christians didn't call it that. To them, it was simply the first day of the week, which commemorated the creation of the world when God declared, "Let there be light," in Genesis. In a Christian context, it also came to reflect God's new creation in Jesus Christ because of his resurrection. Thus, by the AD 50s, Christians were worshiping on this day, and by the late AD 60s, when the book of Revelation was written, it had come to be known as the Lord's Day, because of Jesus' resurrection. Similarly, right around AD 108, the early church father Ignatius of Antioch wrote that those Jews who had lived in antiquated practices came to newness of hope, no longer keeping the Sabbath, but living in accordance with the Lord's Day, on which our life also arose through him, meaning Jesus, and his death. The next term we need to understand is Sabbath. In ordinary Jewish speech, the Sabbath was overwhelmingly used to refer to the day of the week known to us as Saturday, even though it technically began on Friday night in the first century for them. There are a few exceptions to this rule, though, where certain other holy days could be referred to as Sabbaths or periods of rest. These included the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Trumpets, and the first and eighth days of Tabernacles. However, these alternate uses of Sabbath were rare, and none of them occurred when Jesus was crucified, which was at Passover, not Atonement, Trumpets, or Tabernacles. So we should expect the Sabbath at Jesus' crucifixion to just be a weekly Sabbath. Now we're ready to introduce the third term that we need to know, which is Day of Preparation. Modern people aren't typically familiar with the phrase Day of Preparation, but it was a way of referring to the day before the Sabbath, or what we would call Friday. It was called the Day of Preparation because devout Jews had to make preparations to rest on the Sabbath. For example, they needed to prepare all of the food that they would eat on Saturday ahead of time on Friday, because they couldn't work to cook the food. Thus, Moses declared, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay by to be kept till the morning." Friday thus became known as the Day of Preparation. The Jewish Encyclopedia states, "The idea of preparation is expressed by the Greek name paraskue, given by Josephus to that day. In Jerusalem Talmud Pesachim 4:1, the day is called Day of Preparation." So with this as background, let's look at what the four Gospels have to say about when Jesus was crucified. We'll begin with the earliest Gospel, or the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to walk backwards from the morning when the women find the tomb empty. The first verse we want to look at is Mark 16:2, which says, "And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. The women then find the tomb empty, and they encounter angels who tell them that Jesus has risen." Mark said that this happened very early on the first day of the week, or what we would call Sunday. But Mark gives us more information about this day. If we back up just one verse, we read, "When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him." So this tells us that the women went to anoint him very early on the first day of the week, when the Sabbath was past. That reveals that the day before the first day of the week was the Sabbath, and since the regular weekly Sabbath is the last day of the week, or what we would call Saturday, it was a regular weekly Sabbath. We can now back up into Mark chapter 15 and learn about the crucifixion. Beginning with verse 42, we read, "And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb." So this tells us that Jesus was buried when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. Mark even identifies for us that the day of preparation was the day before the Sabbath, and we've already seen that the Sabbath was the day before the first day of the week, or Sunday. So from our first gospel, Mark, we learned that Jesus was crucified and buried on a Friday. His followers rested on the Saturday Sabbath, and they found the tomb empty on Sunday. Now let's see what the next gospel to be written has to say. I've proposed that that gospel is the Gospel of Luke. Again, we'll start with when the tomb was discovered empty. Luke says, "But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus." So Luke agrees with Mark that they found the tomb empty on the first day of the week at early dawn, or what we would call Sunday morning. The day before this, or what we would call Saturday, would be a weekly Sabbath. So let's back up and see what Luke says about that. He says, "On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment." So that's just what you'd expect from a group of observant Jews. Now let's back up again to the crucifixion. Now there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud and laid him in a tomb cut in stone where no one had ever yet been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. So Luke indicates that Jesus was crucified and buried on the day of preparation, or what we would call Friday, and that this was done hurriedly because the Sabbath was beginning on Friday evening and they needed to start their Sabbath rest. So Luke agrees with Mark that Jesus was crucified and buried on a Friday, his followers rested on the Saturday Sabbath, and they found the tomb empty on Sunday. Now let's see what the evidence we have from the third gospel to be written, which I proposed was Matthew's gospel. Concerning the discovery of the empty tomb, Matthew says, "Towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb." So Matthew agrees with Mark and Luke that the empty tomb was discovered towards the dawn of the first day of the week, or Sunday. Now let's back up to learn about the day before, and we don't have to back up far because what we just quoted is the second part of a sentence. If we read the whole sentence, it says this: "Now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb." So this confirms that the empty tomb was discovered on the first day of the week after the Sabbath, or what we would call Saturday. Matthew also reveals something else that happened on this Saturday. If we back up to Matthew 27:62, we learn that the next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people, 'He is risen from the dead,' and the last fraud will be worse than the first." So Matthew indicates that on the Sabbath, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees asked Pilate to set a guard on the tomb until the third day, since Jesus had said, "After 3 days I will rise." They thus identified the first day as the day of the crucifixion, the second day as the day they're making this request, and the third day as the day Jesus said he would rise. Matthew has said that this request was made the next day, that is, after the day of preparation. So if we back up a little further, we get to the burial, and we read that on the day of preparation, or Friday, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus, and he received Jesus' body and buried it. So Matthew agrees with Mark and Luke that Jesus was crucified and buried on a Friday. His followers rested on the Saturday Sabbath, and they found his tomb empty on Sunday. Now let's look at the evidence from the fourth gospel to be written, which scholars generally hold was John. He states that, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb." John focuses in particular on Mary Magdalene rather than the other women who were with her, and he reports that she discovered the empty tomb on the first day of the week, early while it was still dark. That agrees with the other three Gospels that the discovery was made early on Sunday, around the time the sun came up. Mark says that the women were at the tomb very early on the first day of the week when the sun had risen. Luke says that they were there at early dawn. Matthew says that they were there towards dawn on the first day of the week, and John says that they were there early while it was still dark. So they probably left for the tomb shortly before sunrise, as John indicates and Matthew suggests, but the sun came up while they were still there, as Luke suggests and Mark indicates. We can even calculate the time of day more precisely. If, as I proposed in episode 43 of the Jimmy Akin podcast, the crucifixion happened on Friday, April 3rd, AD 33 on the Julian calendar, the empty tomb was discovered around sunrise on Sunday, April 5th. The sun rose in Jerusalem at 6:27 a.m. on Sunday, April 5th, so the women probably arrived at the tomb shortly before this and were still there shortly after this. Setting that matter aside, though, John still indicates that Mary was at the tomb on the first day of the week, early. Now, let's back up and see what John has to say about the crucifixion and the Sabbath. In John 19:31, he says, "Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away." So John indicates that the crucifixion was on the day of preparation, but they needed to get the bodies off the crosses quickly because they couldn't remain there on the Sabbath. And John adds that that Sabbath was a high day because it was the Sabbath that fell during Passover week. The guards thus broke the legs of the two criminals, but Jesus was already dead, so they didn't break his. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took away his body. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. So John indicates that Jesus' burial took place after these things on the day of preparation, or what we would call Friday, and they needed to get him into the tomb quickly because the Sabbath was about to begin at sundown. So because the Jewish day of preparation was ended, and because of the nearness of the tomb, they buried Jesus there. John thus agrees with Mark, Luke, and Matthew that Jesus was crucified and buried on a Friday or day of preparation. His followers rested on the Saturday Sabbath, and they found the tomb empty on Sunday or the first day of the week. We thus find that all four Gospels agree on the same chronology. All four indicate that Jesus was crucified on the Jewish day of preparation, or what we would call Friday. All four indicate that his followers rested and that he lay in the tomb on the Jewish Sabbath, or what we would call Saturday. And all four indicate that this was a weekly Sabbath because all four agree that it was the day immediately before the first day of the week, or what we would call Sunday. The traditional Christian chronology of Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter or Resurrection Sunday is thus firmly grounded in the text of all four Gospels. Jesus indicated that he would rise on the third day after his crucifixion, meaning on the Sunday that followed the weekly Sabbath and the day of preparation on which he was crucified. Because Jews frequently counted parts of days as whole days, they would say that he lay in the tomb for 3 days, or part of Friday, all of Saturday, and part of Sunday. And in a single verse in all the Gospels, Matthew 12:40, this phrase is rendered as 3 days and 3 nights. But this is a figurative expression, not a literal 72 hours. In light of all the other evidence we have from all four of the Gospels, the fact that Jesus was crucified on a Friday and rose on a Sunday is firm. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit the bell notification so you'll always get notified when I have a new video. And you can also help me keep making the podcast and get yourself early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Thank you. I'll see you next time, and God bless you always.